Hello, I am Anavultus, and welcome today to Getting the Answers with my wonderful co-host here.
Yes, hello everybody. I'm the breakdown with Berckenhoff or the breakdown with WB.
Yeah, today's topic is going to be Afghanistan. I've titled the stream Afghanistan Past and Future because we're going to talk a little bit about the recent history of Afghanistan, and also perhaps we can discuss what went right, what went wrong, and perhaps some ideas for the future.
Yes, of course. Afghanistan has a very long history, and I feel like many people tend to focus on more recent events when the country itself has been around for a lot longer than some probably even know it has existed for.
Indeed. Yes, Afghanistan has a very long history. Now that being said, it doesn't a lot of that history isn't as a unified country of Afghanistan. It's as different regions, frequently belonging to other countries, and of course this is reflected in the diversity of the Afghan population, where there's all sorts of different ethnic groups. I'm currently looking at some statistics: 42% Pashtun, 27% Tajik, 9% Hazara, 9% Uzbek, and there's other groups as well. So Afghanistan has developed different populations, both through its own geographical divisions and also through migrations of various people that have gone in and out of it over the years.
Right. It's a it's a very long history with many types of people and many types of religion, which also comes to play.
Yeah. So I will say that an important element here is that there's a myth about Afghanistan that has existed for some time that is easily disprovable, and that is the idea that Afghanistan is a graveyard of empires, an unconquerable country, or something like that. And I'll just briefly say that Afghanistan has been conquered many times in the past. It's been conquered by various Iranian dynasties from ancient times throughout the Middle Ages. It's been conquered by the Greeks. It's been conquered by the Kushans, by the Hunas, by the Mongols, by the Turks, and in just the 1800s, Afghanistan became a protected state for the British. So I think the idea that Afghanistan is unconquerable or that it is the graveyard of empires, if you look at history in a broad sense, is false.
Right. I think that that claim is a lot. Once again, it goes back to people only focusing on recent events and recent history, because that claim could be said for recent events and recent happenings from the Soviet Union to what happened very recently for the United States. But that claim isn't true for many of the years of before that.
Indeed. So I think one thing that is interesting about Afghanistan is that relatively recently it was a monarchy. What you had was that Afghanistan actually had an empire that was expanding into regions that are today parts of Pakistan, but eventually it contracted, and then the British invaded a few different times until it became their protectorate as the Emirate of Afghanistan, and then it became an independent kingdom in the period between World War One and World War Two, and ultimately as history unfolded, Afghanistan ended up during the Cold War having a bit of a mixed influence because it was a neutral country, but they decided to accept investment from both sides of a Cold War. So its military, particularly its officer corps, they were trained in the Soviet Union, but a lot of other people in Afghanistan had Western educations. And then, of course, there was the more conservative religious leaders, many of whom were educated in Egypt during this time. And you could say that this presented a conflict between the socialists aligned with the Soviets, the liberals aligned with the West, and the conservatives aligned with more more conservative religious positions, which led to a bit of a social tension as you had the urban areas that were more westernized and actually had a significant amount of investment from the foreign countries. Then you had the military, which leaned heavily towards socialism, and the rural areas, which were still very conservative. And this can be seen in other countries nowadays. For example, you can see something like this in Turkey, where you have the more liberal urban centers such as Istanbul, but then the more eastern rural part of the country has a lot more conservative leanings. And a lot of people would argue that at this time, Afghanistan was in a period of stability and a period of prosperity and a period of development. Now, at this point, the king of Afghanistan decided that he wanted to shift into a more constitutional monarchy, so he was actively limiting his own powers and also pushing back against long-standing nepotism that is common in a lot of monarchies. And ultimately, however, one of his relatives overthrew him and established his own regime with the support of the military in a military coup. But ultimately, the military leaders were dissatisfied with the new regime and decided to launch a second coup. And this was happening in the 70s in order to bring in a communist country. So Afghanistan became a communist country during this time and had its own communist leaders. And the communists pushed forward a lot of reforms that were disliked by the rural population. And the communists eventually began purging Western influences as well as each other, which caused a problem. And eventually there were rebellions in Afghanistan in various areas, which were brutally pushed down by the communists, killing many, many civilians in the process. And ultimately, the situation in Afghanistan became so bad that the Soviet Union decided to interfere, and or intervene, as you could say. So the Soviets went into Afghanistan. They got rid of the leader that was in charge at the time and put a leader that they thought would be better, because at this time the Soviet Union was moving away from the Stalinist position. So they didn't like the more harsh dictatorial type regimes and preferred more relaxed regimes. But the damage was already done, and there were numerous rebellious groups throughout the country that are collectively termed as the Mujahideen. And they eventually were supported by the United States as part of a Cold War. The United States gave a lot of support to the rebel groups in Afghanistan, a lot of which were composed of these more conservative elements fighting against the socialists. Ultimately, the Soviet Union ran into trouble. A lot of people attribute Afghanistan for this. I don't. I think that that's a bit of an excessive correlation. I think that a lot of it had to do with other internal problems of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. because we see there were rebellions and revolutions in Eastern Europe against the Soviets in this time period, the late 80s. And ultimately, the Soviets left, but the socialist government was still in charge for a few years, and until ultimately the leader decided to step down, seeing that the cause was essentially lost, and a lot of the countryside was in control of various rebel leaders. And they tried to establish a provisional government that, in order to keep the country united, but the new provisional government wasn't able to consolidate control over Afghanistan, which led to regions rising up under various warlords in order to try to push their own position in taking control of Afghanistan, or in other cases, perhaps simply for their own personal gain. But ultimately, as these different groups fought, a new one emerged that became very prominent, and that is the Taliban, which eventually managed to gain dominance over most of the country in the 90s. And with the exception of a small region under control of the remaining unaffiliated warlords who allied together as what people call the Northern Alliance or the United Front. But as the history of Afghanistan went on, an Arabian who had fought on the side of the Mujahideen, because there were people from other countries moving to Afghanistan to fight against the Soviets. His name was Osama bin Laden, and he had his own organization, Al-Qaeda, which decided to, as a reprisal for U.S. support for Israel throughout the 80s and 90s, and the siege of Beirut, in which a number of buildings were destroyed. It was 1982. Osama bin Laden decided to launch attacks against the United States, and these are the famous 9/11 attacks, which damaged the Pentagon and the World Trade Center. So the U.S., of course, for the U.S., this was a huge moment of crisis. It was a moment that I think is a real seminal moment in the foreign policy of the U.S. in the following years, and also in the a lot of things changed because of 9/11 in the U.S. I think is a good way to say that, and this led to the U.S. demanding that the Taliban hand over Osama bin Laden and other terrorists, and also allow the inspection of the camps that the terrorists, as they are called, were using in Afghanistan. The Taliban refused this, initially outright, but then later on moving on to a position of requiring evidence of bin Laden's involvement. But the U.S. Wasn't interested in this type of negotiation. So the U.S., because the Taliban had allowed bin Laden to operate an attack against the U.S. from not necessarily their territory directly, because the 9/11 attacks weren't planes coming out of Afghanistan, but the headquarters with bin Laden were in Afghanistan. And because he was using their territory as for his campaign, under international relations, this is a bit of a problematic thing. This is the reason, for example, why Turkey or the Ottomans in World War I, when they let German ships go through the Bosporus, that was considered an act of war, or why in the Falklands War the British couldn't use Gibraltar because they would have had to go through Spanish maritime waters. So if you are allowing somebody else to use your territory in order to wage a war, generally that's considered as siding with that party, internationally speaking. So,
Right.
so when the Taliban had refused to hand over Osama bin Laden, this was the reason why the U.S. went into Afghanistan in 2001, and they took down the control that the Taliban had over the country, as well as the Al-Qaeda positions within Afghanistan that they could find. However, bin Laden did barely manage to escape into Pakistan, where some years later he was assassinated. But anyway,
Yes.
so the U.S. went into Afghanistan and they teamed up with the Northern Alliance in order to create a new government for Afghanistan. There were some problems early on because a lot of the warlords wanted to gain control of various regions of the country, but instead the U.S. opted to support a democratic government in Afghanistan, which went not as well as they would have hoped, as we can see nowadays. But after several years in Afghanistan, the U.S. had been fighting the Taliban, Al Qaeda, and other organizations. For example, more recently, the Islamic State Khorasan province, which operates there, which is also an enemy of the Taliban. The U.S. decided to come to an agreement with the Taliban to leave Afghanistan fully and to have the Taliban negotiate with the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. But this negotiation ended up not taking place as the Taliban took over most of Afghanistan, with the exception of a small area within the country, which is still held with by troops that are loyal to the old regime. But that's the situation in which we are today. And of course, there's a lot of things I didn't mention, a lot of things I glossed over, but that's just the general political history of who was in charge and what happened with the territory. And of course,
Right, for
it wasn't
sure.
just the U.S. that went into Afghanistan; it was other countries as well.
Yes, of course. It's been an area that many countries have wanted to make more stable or have influence over because of resources, you could say, or many other examples you could use. And as you also mentioned, there's a lot of details to this timeline that you could also mention as well. But uh, basically, there's a lot of events that have happened in Afghanistan. That is for sure. And there's also details from within events you have mentioned that could we could make whole episodes on in for sure.
Yeah,
And I don't necessarily want to get into you know, conspiracy theories on this episode, really. Not that this really is a conspiracy theory, but I remember hearing and reading that on the timeline event where you mentioned Osama bin Laden escaping, I remember reading that they did have uh, eyes on him and they were waiting to hear if they could go ahead and they never got the word so they didn't go ahead and that's how he escaped. Is that true? I don't know, but that's just one example I thought of in this process here, but
yeah.
like I
Well,
said, you can
I
make
think that speaks to something interesting about Afghanistan, um, in the war that the United States and other countries were fighting. That the way the United States fought the war has been criticized heavily by a number of different people for a number of different reasons. And one of these, it was the exact the it's the way you fight a war. For some reason, I forgot the exact term for this. The rules of engagement. There you go. The rules of engagement. Because the United States, the military writes up rules of engagement when they're going to war on what the military is allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do in battle, and how they are to conduct themselves, and how things are to go. And I've heard some pretty weird stories about the rules of engagement, where if there is a potential for any civilian to possibly be in an area, they have to avoid shooting civilians at all costs, even if there's enemy troops interspersed in the area. Now, in past wars, if we go back to World War One, World War Two, this wouldn't have been that way. If there's civilians in an area, they just happen to be there, and that's war. But nowadays, we have to avoid civilians as much as possible, and in some ways, this has made it very difficult to operate in certain situations. And in other ways, this actually allows for as a valid tactic, the use of human shields. Um,
Yeah, we talked about this human shield concept, and when we did the Israel and Palestine episode, where we talked about that conflict when it was in its height, and there was was it Hassan, or am I thinking of something else? What was the group there? Damn, I
in
can't think of the
Palestine,
name. In Palestine, yes.
there's a number of different groups operating there. That there's the PLO.
Yeah, I was. It was the head group. I'm trying to think of their name. I'm pretty sure it started with H, but I could be mistaken on this. But they were using human shields, and they or have used human shields, and Israel said that they still were at the time. But anyway, I was basically saying that in that example, you could use they were using human shields, and also even though this is a recent event, many people have blamed Biden again for his usage of the bomb he did after the attack on the Marines at the airport and Afghan citizens at the airport, because it's believed that some citizens died in that bombing too. So that could be technically against the rules of engagement, in a typical rules of engagement at least. Uh, but yeah, so I thought we mentioning that as well.
Hamas is
Hamas, that's it.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
So yes.
yeah. Well, I think that's not the only problem. The over emphasis on the security of civilians, which of course recently went completely out of the window when we hear about 6 children being killed in a drone strike. So
Right.
it's a bit inconsistent in the way it happens. I think another one is that you hear stories about soldiers, and there's fire coming out of a building, but in order to attack the building, they have to call the guy that's in charge of the whole operation. And when I say the operation, I mean the entire operation. That is, the guy who's in charge of the entire war in Afghanistan. They have to call that guy in order to make a call on a battlefield that he's not on, whether they can attack a particular building. And you hear this in these stories where I'm wondering, are they fighting to win? What's happening? it,
Yeah.
I mean, I'd imagine that ideally the control over whether or not they're going to attack a building would go to someone who's actually at the battlefield. Uh,
You would think. You
Yeah,
would think.
but uh, if you accidentally kill a few civilians, even though they're in the same building with armed combatants, it would in some way be considered, if not a war crime, a reason to make a lot of paperwork. So essentially, there's disadvantages to actually taking the initiative and taking a risk. And that being said, I'm not saying that there should be targeting of civilians. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. To be very clear, what I am saying is that if there are civilians next to a military target, I would consider that to be, you know, just something that happens in war. Something that, it happens. What are you going to do about it? But nowadays, a lot of people in the military, they just simply, that's an unacceptable risk. And the way that operates, I think it's no surprise that the US wasn't making a lot of progress in a lot of cases. But another issue, I heard this from a Pulitzer Prize winning guy who was giving a lecture about military issues. He was saying that the way in which the Pentagon operates its officers is a lot different from how they used to in World War II. And by that he means that it used to be that if an officer does a poor job, or he's not a team player, or he messes up in some other way, he would be relieved and replaced by someone else. And that this was preferable over perhaps a more micromanagement type action, where the officer makes his own decisions and is responsible for his own decisions. And this relief doesn't mean that it's the end of his career. It just means that he might have to take opportunities elsewhere to further his own military career. But instead, since the Korean War, they decided to rotate commands, and they decided not to do this old method of only having people in there who actually succeed. So we see repeated failures on the battlefield, but nobody is really held responsible for that. And I'm not saying that it's a complete disaster in the sense that U.S. troops are being wiped out and anything like that. What I'm saying is that there's a lack of progress, and you should expect to have progress, and so that is a problem in that sense.
Right, for sure. Uh, Ultimately, I think a lot of people would take this perspective. When you decide that you're going to intervene, and especially if you decide you're going to war with a country, that you would go to war. You know what I mean? Like, it comes with certain aspects to what is required
Yeah.
to do it. Kind of this in between stage of just kind of, you know, making Afghanistan your second home in a way, and slowly trying to influence it, and getting soldiers killed, and Afghanistan's killed across multiple years, ultimately is a lot longer version that potentially is going to lead to more deaths on both sides than an actual war. That may sound a little crazy to say, but when it lasts for 20 years, it's not necessarily.
Yeah. Well, here's the problem.
But yeah,
the The U.S. was in Afghanistan for 20 years, and in that time accomplished very little. They could have left 2 years in, and you could say that they might have accomplished the same amount. So the question is, what happened in all that other time? And I'll tell you what happened. Okay, the presidents Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden decided that it was fine to prop up one of the most dysfunctional and ineffective governments that has ever existed. And they thought that leaving it like that and then leaving the country would be fine. Okay? Now, that being said, you might ask, well, does the US even have a responsibility in Afghanistan? What does it matter to the US what happens in Afghanistan? Well, that's an interesting question, I would ask. I would say. We could say that the reason the US went into Afghanistan was obviously in response to 9/11 and the Taliban's uh, protection of Osama bin Laden. Now, the problem is that this means that the US essentially either went into Afghanistan and as a response to 9/11 or decided not to and therefore had no serious response to 9/11, which from a perspective of getting elected again would be suicidal, and also from a perspective of international politics, you get a huge attack against your country and you don't do anything significant, then that's a sign of weakness. So essentially, what I'm saying is the U.S. had to go into Afghanistan. So in that sense, geopolitically, from a position of position of realist international relations, it was the correct move to go into Afghanistan. Now, then the question is, what then after that? And here's the thing. If the US simply went into Afghanistan, killed Al-Qaeda, and messed up the Taliban a bit, and then they left, let's say 2 years after, then does that actually solve the problem? Because the same conditions that that existed before the intervention could easily then reemerge after the intervention. Therefore, it would be, while it might be a military success, strategically, on a grand strategy sense, it wouldn't change anything. In
Right.
fact, the fact that only things were destroyed and nothing was built would also cause a lot of resentment, which would perhaps lead to the Taliban being more strongly aligned with Al Qaeda, because the Taliban itself wasn't interested in attacking the U.S. But if the U.S. attacked them and then just left, then they might actually consider being more strongly supportive of Al Qaeda. So in that sense, the argument for staying longer in Afghanistan makes sense so long as your goal is to change the the situation so that the conditions that initially led to you going into Afghanistan are not repeated again.
Right. You can. Right, for sure. The idea of not intervening for a lot of people is going to be seen as a weakness and isn't going to necessarily work as far as what the president's goal is for protecting the country. I do want to note that there are people who say that we should have never intervened, and they have relatively interesting ideas about that, such as Harry Brown. For anybody who wants to check out his work, um, he's been somebody who's, I think he's dead now, a matter of fact. But anyway, he was writing a lot of things during that time period about not intervening and the reasons as to why. But also, I know that there are many people. I think Dave Smith said this. He has a podcast as well, where he was basically like he understands the need of a president or the need of a country to get back at somebody for an attack like 9/11, because 9/11 was horrendous. You know, it was terrible, and many people's lives are still affected from it. So he understands the need to fire back essentially, but he was saying like, why don't we do, a fire back quickly and then pull back? and don't stay there. And
Yeah.
that was kind of his perspective. Now, you answered a little bit to that as would that actually work? It's hard to say, but we can definitely say that what we did in these 20 years didn't work.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So
it's kind of,
I'm
yeah,
obviously not saying that the U.S. did a good job with what they did, because I've already criticized how the rules of engagement, how they managed their officers, and the fact that they supported the this government that ended up not working at all. But the question then is, well, what do you do? Because you have to do a reprisal for the attack, because if you don't do that, then you're weak, and also politically that's political suicide. So I would say, uh, let's say if Al Gore was in charge instead of Bush in 2001, I think he would have done the same thing in response to 9/11. Or if anybody else had been in charge and 9/11 had happened, I think the invasion of Afghanistan would have happened. What I'm saying is that this type of reprisal is essentially something that had to happen regardless of other conditions.
you're saying the process of intervening, or what exactly?
What
Like,
I'm saying is, in response to 9/11 and the
mm,
Taliban's support of Osama bin Laden, and the refusal of them to arrest him, the U.S. in any case would have invaded Afghanistan.
okay. I mean, I would agree with that. I'm not entirely sure if it was still necessarily the best strategy, and we can, you could argue over that for a long time. But I agree that any president would probably end up taking that route. I
Yeah,
think you almost have to as a figurehead of the country. Do I agree with it? Not necessarily, but that doesn't really matter when you're talking about being the president.
yeah. So that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that I'm happy that the U.S. had to go into Afghanistan, but I'm saying that politically speaking, they had to. Both because from an international relations perspective, and also from a domestic popularity perspective. So it was pretty much not viable, a non-viable position not to go into Afghanistan. Now, that being said, as I said earlier, I think that the war was conducted very poorly, because if the U.S. does go to war, I would imagine the U.S. would want to win a war. So what exactly went wrong other than the rules of engagement and the staffing of generals? Well, I think another point is the war on opium in Afghanistan was very ineffective, because when the Taliban was in charge of Afghanistan, they in 2001 they ordered all the opium farmers to destroy their crops. Now, some people assume that they were banning opium, but what we see is that they still had stockpiles of it. They weren't destroying what had already been harvested. They simply weren't allowing them to plant that year. So, some people, most people that analyze this, think that rather than an action against opium itself, it was an action to put a to manipulate the market by reducing supply, uh, or reducing the expectation of supply. But the U.S. went in, and although the U.S. had, in some ways, officially decided to move against opium, opium hit record numbers during the U.S. Occupation of Afghanistan. In fact, far exceeding what had previously been produced under the Taliban. So why is this? How could this happen? Well, the answer is the US probably wasn't being very serious about this, because opium, of course, comes from the poppies. So a field of poppies is very visible from the air. It's something that's pretty hard to hide. And there's large scale cultivation and increased cultivation while the US was in there. And I even hear stories, I'm not entirely sure if they are true or not, but that the US troops were even protecting the farming there. So, in that sense, there was a failure. Another area, the training of Afghan troops. We hear stories about US soldiers trying to train Afghan troops, and they have no discipline. They don't care for their equipment, and they leave for months at a time, and then and of course there's also ghost battalions, which is to say that an officer gets given a lot of money to raise a regiment or something, but ultimately he decides not to, and instead the soldiers only exist on paper, and then he pockets the money for himself. So that happens as well. So how is it that the Soviets were able to successfully train Afghan soldiers and Afghan officers to a good level of discipline, but the US were not able to? The answer is that the US didn't put enough incentive for the soldiers to actually become effective soldiers. And what I mean by that, I don't mean that they should have paid them more, although in many cases their officers were intercepting their pay a bit. But I think that discipline in the Afghan military should have been held to a higher standard. And it used to be in many militaries that if you're supposed to be on duty and then you leave, that's a desertion, and you get the death penalty for that. But in Afghanistan, it wasn't that way recently. And there weren't any major penalties for soldiers that deserted. And they weren't being drilled harshly. And so what I'm thinking here is that the US soldiers who were training these people were obviously not holding them to a very high standard. And they weren't punishing them for their shortcomings. So I think that while it is true that a lot of this is the fault of the Afghan military and their corruption, I think it is also the fault of the US soldiers for not being able to train these people. Because the Soviets have shown that these people can be trained, and and of course the Taliban is training their own men as well. But the US wasn't able to train these soldiers. So it's no surprise then that soldiers run when there's a sign of danger, that they lose their guns and then they're unarmed, or that something else happens, or that they just go home to their farms when they're supposed to be on duty. So in essence, this is also a failing of the US, because the US subsidized the Afghan military heavily and did not ensure that any of that came to actual effective use. The US also subsidized the Afghan government, yet the Afghan government is notoriously corrupt, was notoriously corrupt. I'm talking about the Republic. And what we see is the story of the president, Ashraf Ghani. He's running away, and he's got so much cash that he can't put it all on his helicopter when he's leaving. So he leaves he leaves the money with literally as much cash as he can carry. And what we see is that it was a kleptocracy, that the people in charge were simply siphoning American money, American taxpayer money, and using that money to enrich themselves, And the U.S. under presidents Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden decided that this was fine because there's no way they didn't know that this was happening. There's been reports about ghost
Oh yeah.
battalions for years. So I'm just wondering if these people think that this is fine for Afghanistan, what do they think is fine for America? So,
Right.
yeah.
And to be somewhat fair to the soldiers, not that you necessarily have to be, you hear many soldiers on like YouTube channels or even articles written in like the New York Times and Washington Post and all these other, sites you hear of telling, their army superiors and generals that look, this isn't working. And they've been saying this for years and years and years. So yes, you could put some blame that like, look, it's your responsibility to make it work. But at the same time, if you're like, look, we've tried everything we could think of and it's not working, then they're like, oh, okay, you can do 5 more years of this, or yeah, you can do. So the blame is in a lot of people are to be blamed for this for
Yeah,
sure.
but the congressmen, okay, here in the U.S., they're just simply happy that Afghanistan had a liberal democracy as a government when it clearly was one of the most ineffective governments in history. And here's my position on this: even if it's a democracy, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and you have to get rid of it. That's what I say. Sometimes a democracy works very well, sometimes it doesn't, and if it doesn't work, you have to get rid of it. So a lot of people criticize the administrations for nation building, but honestly, I'm wondering if they were seriously trying to build anything, uh, because it became a huge money laundering scheme.
Right.
So yeah, so in that sense, because this is going to be controversial, but why build a highly corrupt nation when you already have a very functional nation? What I'm saying is, if the US had annexed Afghanistan instead of putting forward some haphazard money laundering scheme and pretending that it's a government, the US actually would have been able to do a lot better in Afghanistan, I would say. So,
Yeah, that is an interesting theory, but ultimately, you can't force a culture upon people.
well, I'm not
And
saying you have to force a culture. What I'm saying
no,
is,
no, no.
you,
I didn't say you were that, but yeah.
I'm saying is you force law and order, because if there's corruption, you have to get rid of it. It doesn't matter what the culture is.
Right. Yeah, right. I see what you're saying, but the idea of trying to make someone use a government that works for you doesn't necessarily always going to work for them. And I think we live totally different lives. People who are Afghanistan citizens and people who are United States citizens live entirely different lives.
Yeah.
So it's hard to necessarily, work with the same sort of government. Can it work? Maybe, probably, but I don't think we should try it again to see. So,
Yeah. But the idea is that if you're going to destroy something, you should build something to replace it. That's my idea. So if you're going to destroy the Taliban regime for their support of Bin Laden, then you have to build something to replace it, because that's the honorable thing to do. Okay. I don't think we should just go in and destroy something and then leave and pretend like we've done a good job, because it, I don't think it is something that is very honorable, is my position there. So while I don't think that the US should be looking for opportunities to go into a countries and doing regime changes, that's not what I'm in favor of. Let me be very clear on that. I think that if there is a situation where the US does have to invade a country, the US should be ready to leave that country better than when they arrived. And what we see is that this is really not the case. And and we see that four presidents had the opportunity to do something about this, and none of them pulled through on this. And so I think that that's just an awful situation there.
Right. Um, what do you think about, other members of, I don't know, what do you think about other, American citizens that were in Afghanistan trying to like prop up the government through, I don't know, aids or research, whatever because you know how you heard a bunch of people were escaping who were American citizens who were propping up the government or helping the government. What do you? Obviously, it didn't work that well, but do you, do you think that that was a attempted good strategy or like
Well, I think that if the U.S. wanted Afghanistan to be its own country, I think they should have allowed Afghanistan to train its own people to do this stuff. Because what's happened is that suddenly a bunch of people from other countries left, and now uh, there's nobody in Afghanistan who was trained to do what they were supposed to do, and that was actually one of the weaknesses of the Afghan government, the republic, was that suddenly all these people left and they didn't have anybody to replace them. So, and I'm talking about the people that left before the country was about to collapse. So
right?
so I think that Afghanistan, if they're going to be their own country, they should have their own people do these things. If the US was interested in annexing Afghanistan, then I think that this would be perfectly fine. But that's not what the US was doing. Now, that being said, the government of Afghanistan, if they want to accept foreign investors, they can do that. And the Taliban says that they would also be happy to accept foreign investment. So, in that sense, we could perhaps be seeing some people return to Afghanistan in a civilian function that may have been there before. No, that depends on exactly how the Taliban is going to run Afghanistan, and then whether people would consider it to be a safe place to go. But that being said, I think that this is an interesting opportunity to talk about the evacuation. So it has been known that the U.S. would leave for months because Trump made an agreement with the Taliban without including the Republic in the agreement. So that's pretty interesting. That someone who you would imagine would necessarily have to be on the table, at the table, that is, for the agreement, wasn't there. So I think that that's an interesting situation. But anyway, moving on from that, so it was known that the U.S. would leave. Now, some people make the criticism, well, why didn't all of the civilians from the U.S., Australia, Britain, and all these other countries, why didn't they leave, and Germany and others, why didn't they leave when the main part of the military left, or before that, in the lead up to the full situation? Well, the answer to that is the reason why they didn't leave was because they didn't think that the situation would become unsafe. They thought that the allies had put together a strong government that would be able to fend for itself, even though anybody who was in on the actual corruption of the government would be able to tell you that this was not as likely a situation. So in that sense, the Biden administration, as the situation in Afghanistan began to collapse, told the people that were still in Afghanistan that the government would hold out for several more months. Now, the situation unraveled a lot faster than the Biden administration expected. And so people that thought that they could easily come and go for many more days ended up suddenly not having that situation and wanting to leave immediately because the Taliban had gained control of Kabul. So in a way, if the government if the republic had remained in control till today, I don't think people would be saying, "Oh, all these people need to leave." So I think when people say they should have left when the agreement was made, I think that that's a bit of a hindsight moment. Because we can talk about corruption, and that the looking at the corruption, you could say that the government was weak and that it was eventually going to collapse. And so that is something that you can go back into the past and reliably say you should have had the foresight of the problems that the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan was having. But if we then start here and go back and then say that, well, the country was definitely going to collapse, so people should have definitely left months earlier, I think that that's unfair. I think that's an unfair statement because they didn't know the country was going to collapse, and also the Biden administration was telling them that the country wasn't going to collapse. So,
Right.
yeah, so that's on the Biden administration partially, but I would say individually, not everybody is a politically active person that would be in tune with everything that's happening politically. So I think it's fair to say that there could be people who legitimately didn't know that the corruption in Afghanistan was as bad as it was. Now, that being said, the way that the evacuation was handled
Was terrible.
it was terrible because you would expect that the military would control the perimeter of the area so that you don't have people running onto the runway and climbing onto the planes.
As they're taking off.
Yeah, and 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 there was this huge crowd everywhere, all around, trying to get in. And eventually, there was the Islamic State Khorasan province did launch an attack on the militaries and on the Taliban and on the civilians at the airport, and over 100 people died. So, in a way, it's an easy target because there's a lot of people crowded together. But the evacuation allowed many thousands of Afghan refugees to leave, whereas still citizens of the United States and other countries that wanted to leave and that followed the State Department instructions weren't able to. So I would say that the priority for the evacuation should have been the citizens of the coalition countries. Now, that being said, we know that not everybody was in Kabul right away. So I would say in the absence of those people, you could make an argument for bringing other people onto the planes. Now, that being said, then the question becomes that what about the Afghans that the US and other countries wanted to bring out of Afghanistan? Because this, I think, is an interesting question, because the Taliban said that they actually weren't very happy about the Afghans leaving. Now, there's a few different ways you can go in this, and I'm going to take the controversial position and say that the Taliban as being the government, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, being the government that actually controls the territory, should, as a sovereign state, have the right to control its borders and therefore the immigration and emigration of its country. So if the Taliban wants to require immigrants to have exit visas, I don't see a problem. I understand that the UN doesn't like exit visas, but I think that that's a legitimate action as a sovereign state. Now, that being said, a lot of people in the US say that they have an obligation to the translators, to support staff, etc., to protect them from potential reprisal from the Taliban. And that's why they should bring them to the US. I'm a bit more on the fence on this, because I don't think that the US should be necessarily the country that they should be relying on. What they should have relied on is the Republic. Now, that being said, I do blame the US for establishing such a incompetent republic, and we can contrast that to, because some people say regime change never works. You can never get a stable government, but you can look at Iraq, and they have a government that is still functional without the U.S. having to be protecting them from everything. So in that sense, and that's a different culture as well. So while I don't support going into other countries for the purpose of regime change, I think that if you're going to do regime change, you better do it right. And while I don't support just invading other countries, I say that if you're going to invade a country, you better do it right and you better win. And the fact is that the U.S. simply didn't do that. And that is a huge problem.
Right. For sure. One of the weird things to me about this whole evacuation is when you're a president of the country or any military strategy at all, is you have multiple plans for something. And even if something like war or like this evacuation is something that is a live event, meaning that certain things can change and that might have to affect your plan, it's still something you have multiple plans for. It seemed like Biden got caught off guard. Like they never thought something like this could have ever happened. And they were playing, 3 cards behind, trying to catch up. And you could say, well, nobody ever thought that this would happen, that the government would collapse this fast and people would be crowding around the fences like they were and climbing planes. Nobody would have ever thought that. But it's still kind of interesting that they never considered it. For military, usually you would think that there would be so many plans, so many variables that are planned, that they would have a response if the worst case happened. Yeah. And it just didn't seem like this happened.
And I think a lot of people compare this to the fall of Saigon in Vietnam, but I think the situation is different in some ways, because in some ways you could say the problem with military staffing was already there back then, and also I saw a paper that said that one of the reasons the U.S. did so poorly in Vietnam was because of the rules of engagement for air combat. But in the case of Vietnam and Korea, the United States, in Korea, the United States was unwilling to invade China because they didn't want to trigger the Cold War into becoming an open war. And similarly in Vietnam, they didn't want to go into North Vietnam for the same reason, because of a Cold War. Now, in the case of Afghanistan, there was no such situation. If the U.S. had simply decided to annex Afghanistan, make it the 51st state or something, there wouldn't really be anyone who would make a serious objection to that. Not in the sense for policy wise or in the sense of criticism. There certainly would be a lot, but there wouldn't be anyone who would be able to threaten war on the U.S. So essentially, the U.S. in Afghanistan could have done whatever they wanted, yet they still opted to go down a path that you could say was very incompetent. So that, in my view, is a major problem.
Right. There is poor planning all around for all of the 20 years, it seems.
Yeah,
Kind of crazy to think about, really.
yeah. So some people are concerned that the remaining Americans and people of other nationalities in Afghanistan uh, are going to become hostages. Now, I'm going to say the Taliban has said that if they have their travel papers, they're going to let them go, presumably, if not through the airport, through the borders with other countries. And a lot of people lean on the side of not trusting the Taliban to do that. But here's my opinion on this. My opinion is wait and see. You know, they said they're going to do it. Give them a chance to do it, and then if the situation does end up that they start killing the people that were left behind or using them as hostages, you can always go in and kill them. So in that sense, uh, it's not as if you don't have to immediately go to war nowadays. You can say that the U.S. lost a lot of its objectives. The U.S. did get Bin Laden, and the Taliban is in some ways more relaxed on some of its positions than it used to be. For example, nowadays they said that they don't anymore want they won't require women to wear burqas. Now they can just have the hijab like other Middle Eastern countries. So in that sense, they've become more moderate in a number of ways. So maybe that's one of the perhaps benefits of the war having gone on for so long. But ultimately, I say that the U.S. doesn't really have a reason to go back in until something actually happens, until the Taliban actually aggresses against the U.S. and its citizens, or becomes host to yet another aggressing group. Because we know the Taliban is in a conflict with the Islamic State, that is against the Islamic State. And they've had major battles. So I say you wait and see. There's no reason to go back in. The opportunity window has passed for doing major changes in Afghanistan. If it presents itself again in the future, then that will be the problem of the future. But if the Taliban decides to turn over a new leaf and be friendly, you know what? That's good. Embrace that.
We need to be very careful with intervening again. Now, obviously, if there is a event that causes it, like everybody agrees with, I'm not saying that we shouldn't intervene and do something, but I I just don't see any intervening as a good thing anymore for Afghanistan. Uh, so yeah, but yeah, I
Yeah.
also think you have to give the government more time as well. I would agree with that too. Although you would say that you're trusting a terrorist organization
Well,
or
here's the thing about
but
terrorist organizations. Terrorist is actually a technical term in the sense that commonly people use it willy nilly, but in the case of a US government, it's a technical term. So a terrorist is what you call any enemy combatant that you don't want to treat as the soldier of an enemy country, so that you can instead deny them the rights that you would normally have to give them as prisoners of war under treaties that the U.S. has signed. So the U.S. is party to some treaties on the treatment of prisoners of war and on other things, but the United States, by declaring various groups terrorists, is essentially creating a legal fiction that allows it to treat enemy combatants in a way that goes outside of the normal treaties that the U.S. has signed. So I think if the United States wants to go to war with a certain group, the United States should acknowledge the sovereignty of that group and the reality of that group's military power, and therefore then engage with with the enemy group in a way that is friendly to its treaties. And if the treaties are obstructive to the functions of war, then the treaties should simply be repealed, rather than trying to find weird legal fictions to create workarounds.
Right. Uh, that might make things a little more smoother.
Yeah, but anyway, so my thoughts are that unlike some people, I don't think that this was a foregone conclusion in 2001. I think that the US could have done a much better job, but because of incompetence in the military, in the US government, and in the government that the US supported in Afghanistan and their military, and the presidents, all four of them, Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden, we are now in a situation where we messed up quite a lot. Now, that being said, I think that I saw on Fox News people are talking about a hostage situation like it's a foregone conclusion. I say we give the new regime a chance, and if they respect the citizens of those various countries that are in there, and if they don't right to aggress against Afghanistan.
Right, and to conclude for myself on this whole Afghanistan deal, it's hard to say that what we did do through these 20 years was effective in any way, really. It definitely didn't turn out to what any of the presidents probably would have hoped for. I also think in some ways that as a president, they probably had to be done in some ways. You could argue over which way it could have been done, and we talked about that in the episode. But also, I don't necessarily think we should try to do something again like this for, in particular, Afghanistan or really any country unless something absolutely crazy happens again.
Yeah. Uh, let's put a hypothetical. Let's say they round up 1,000 American citizens and they just kill them.
Right.
Let's say that happens today. What do you think that would warrant a second intervention?
It would warrant a response for sure. It's I think I would lean more towards that potential intervention than not an intervention for something like that. Maybe I'm putting a little bit too much faith in the Taliban's motives here, but I don't necessarily think that they would want to start something like this again either.
Yeah,
So I don't see
yeah,
an event like that happening. But
yeah.
yeah,
That's also why I don't think that the fear mongers here are correct. I don't think that the Taliban is interested in bringing the U.S. back to Afghanistan or provoking other countries at this point. I think that as a sovereign country, if they want to have harsh laws on their own people, you know what? If even if I disagree with the laws, that's their country, okay? But I don't think that they have any particular reason why they would want to harm the citizens of other countries if it posed the risk of a second invasion.
Right.
Now, in the case that a second invasion does happen, I hope that that time they actually leave the place better than they found it, uh, unlike this time. But we can hope for a brighter future for Afghanistan. We can hope that the Taliban treats its people well, and and that other countries treat Afghanistan well.
Right. We should hope for the best for the country and for its people.
Yeah,
Anybody that's wanting to wish a country bad just because, we had to pull out or they didn't, respect us or whatever, you want to say is having bad motives, I think.
yeah. So anyway, I think that that's a good place to wrap up. So thank you all for watching our beautiful audience, and we will be seeing you all next week at around the same time as this stream started this week on a Wednesday. Of course, we moved from a Thursday to a Wednesday.
Yes.
Yeah. So goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye, goodbye.